both of y'all brought up some of these terms that I'm hoping to think about, but I was hoping that we could just pause for a few minutes to talk about some of these, I think, like key terms within your pieces and where they've sort of landed you now. So for Kyla, I'm thinking some of these might include over fermentation, yeasty aliveness, maybe in relationship to Nye's animatedness. And for Xine, I'm thinking particularly about disaffected, unfeeling, that sort of divide or relationship between affective and affectable, thinking with De Silva. And I'd love for y'all to talk a bit about how these terms exist and coexist within your texts, and also where they're leading you to today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really in awe of the turn that that disaffected is taking us, the conceptual turn that disaffected is taking us on. I like excess, and my work is told to, I tarry in excess. It's interesting to me. And I tarry in places where desire and disgust are very, are stick to each other. That's where I'm intellectually, and I'm also often drawn to things that are like appalling. I know that I found something that interests me when I laugh at it, and then I'm like, oh, like I laugh, and then I go, oh God, that was like that, and then I'm like, oh, that's my next book, right? Like that particular affect. But what I love, so like I'm interested in excess, and for me, the turn that Jasbir Kaur and Patricia Cloth make in trying to, I think I just said her last name wrong, sorry, but in turning to affect as matter itself, has been very productive for me, because in the new work, I'm much more, and this is again moving to where Sion's work, and Sion was I was actually Sion's first graduate student ever. She's my, speaking of generations, and you know, that Sion's turn to Marxism has been helpful for me also, and seriously with Jasbir's work in trying to think about matter in relation to extraction, or affect in relation to extraction. So for me, fermentation, intoxication, jelly, and then rot, both in the context of impending climate collapse, as if we're not there already, and in terms of being a 19th centuryist, is about thinking with economies of energy, and looking at the forms or figures for excess energy that are not recuperated by capital's desire to extract. And for me, where this meets Xine's work, and Xine, where I'm like so grateful to you, is that, so my turn to excess very rarely leaves space for refusal. But I think like what Xine's work has done is take the dead-ended closed systemness of the antisocial turn, right? Like the antisocial turn, especially with No Future, it's just like this Fordist machine of despair. It's like, nope, put this in, it spits out refusal, and like that's the end, right? And it was like, for me, the antisocial turn was like, I don't have any good questions for, like, it's just not producing any good questions. It's just producing a very tight aesthetic performance of impermeability. And then actually what Xine has done in her book is which I find so fascinating, is to take the antisocial turn and say, but actually perhaps the antisocial turn, instead of taking us to a dead end, opens up to forms of collective refusal, or collectivity in refusal, which is a kind of opening. So refusal is not a closure, it's actually an opening, and an unwillingness to be extracted from collectively. So yeah, that's where I kind of see our work touching each other, but where I see Xine taking us to a really new place in her work.
Sorry, that's my initial reaction. I'm just, it's just so overwhelming that even over the past month, like just hearing that people are reading what you've been working on and responding to it. I just feel so, it's so strange, and wonderful. But okay, I need to respond to the actual question about disaffection and disaffected. And I know that there's sort of this contradiction often with how I present my work and how and what I tend to say. And part of it is like, I think sort of speaks to the way that I see that anti-sociality opening to other forms of sociality, that notably, like, I don't seem particularly detached, or like, I think it's important to say like the things I love, the people that I care about that have been motivating me in this work or have been helping me survive that work. And again, for me, it's about like then not just not caring, not giving a fuck, I guess, about the things that you're supposed to care about. And so that's why for me, like the classic Munoz Edelman discussion is like not an either or, but a both and, which is, you know, that formulation that we love to overuse, but it's also true, just as the meme says, why not both? And I think it's really, really generative in that regard. With disaffection, there's of course a number of different genealogies. One, which was like, I remember that the first form of unfeeling I was really thinking about was Oriental inscrutability in my project. And that came from, of course, reading Suisse Farr's work and then finding all these resonances with her experience as this queer, disabled Chinese woman who lived between the US, Canada, and England, and then finding myself sort of taking that route myself and feeling this sort of obduracy in her work that doesn't so easily simply fall along the lines of Christian sentimentalism, the way that it sometimes is read, and being like, and then she showed them that the Chinese were human. And I was like, really, is that what's happening? I think like what's happening is far more complicated than that. And so of course there's also a lot of work thinking about how she's playing with it, but I'm like, what if we completely put pressure on the Oriental inscrutability, which, as I point out, is like the most nameable queer racialized form of a genealogy of unfeeling. And I remember that like Lauren Berlant came to Cornell, and I sort of like sat up and I was like, I'm thinking of unfeeling Oriental inscrutability. And she's like, oh, take a look at the work I did on Mysterious Skin. And so I read that, and then I found like the citation to Martin Manalance's work, which then was like really generative to me in terms of how he thinks from this, of course, this queer color perspective about Filipinx care workers in the global economy, and like the way that there's the political, causal, affective implications of disaffection. And I was thinking like this is such an exciting idea. Like I like then looked at his other work and I was like, how are we not like we're sort of returned to it? And I was like, oh, I feel like there's just so many possibilities that are opened up by seeing what happens when we allow it to be a term that can be mobilized on so many different scales and so many different contexts. Disaffection for me also comes out of the way that like post-Trump, we saw so many pieces on the disaffected Trump voter, and then in the UK, the disaffected Brexiteer. And also the primary reaction that I tend to have received when presenting on my work, which is always, well, what about, well, don't we have to get across to like these white people? But they're the ones who are really disaffected, aren't they? And I'm like, I feel like this is the point that I'm trying to make, is also why is it these people are the only one who are allowed to have this legible form of disaffection, as opposed to the way, as I sort of point out, that like there's in looking at how the different hierarchies in comparative racialization are constituted, Oriental inscrutability can have a name, but like affect that's racialized as Black is never seen as legitimate, regardless of what form it takes and what level of expressivity. If it's overexpressive or underexpressive, regardless, it's not taken as being valid as a form of feeling. And that being sort of, they say, it's sort of constituting the negation and underside. Whereas I think that Oriental inscrutability is able to be nameable in a way that shows like this partial respect for its sort of aestheticization, which ends up being fetishized, that I think also reflects that complicated wedge-like quality in which East Asians continually tend to be mobilized for anti-Black and settler colonial purposes, according to different regimes of power. And so I feel, to me, it's a word that does a lot of work, and I think really makes my point about thinking about unfeeling from below as opposed to always thinking about it as oppression from above. That again, potentially the fact that that's always the sort of defense or reaction that raising these questions end up causing. And also I'd like to say that to Kyla's earlier comments about the piece on civility, that like it just resonates so much, particularly, of course, obviously working in the former colonial metropole, but the way that civility is something that's marshaled time and time again around thinking about academic freedom when it has to come to institutional racism and transphobia in particular, which is a number of battles that we're fighting institutionally right now, and that the rhetoric of care and the rhetoric of civility being one that somehow legitimates one side saying that trans people don't have a right to exist and are invalid, as opposed to trans people saying like, please stop debating my humanity and validity. Yeah, so it's like, I feel like what Kyla and I are also trying to do this moment is like showing like that there's intellectual genealogies, there are effective genealogies that of thinking with and also feeling with who we're in, but also like in a very real way that the sort of work of being in the institution and being in everyday life and the way that we end up managing our psychic lives is something that is feeding into our work. And that's like another important citational politics to enact.
This is quick and I think actually very connected to what you're talking about, Xine, but one of the sort of many locations that I felt like there were resonances within your works were thinking about that move to explicitly racialize affect studies and to just consider comparative racialization in your work overall. From Kyla, I'm thinking of one particularly amazing line in Racial Indigestion where you write that Black characters and subjects inhabit the limits of language and aesthetic form, performing moments of spectacular visibility, at times despite and beyond the creator's intentions. And then from Xine, I'm thinking, you say, we know, indeed, have always known that white feelings produce and maintain structures of domination. So I guess I would just love to sort of continue with what y'all were talking about and just think about that move to racialize affect studies and your work, and to consider how racialization ends up being so deeply entangled or intermeshed necessarily with disaffection and terms like hyper-embodied, or I think considerations of materiality in your work too, Kyla.
Xine, Habibti, you go first.
Yeah, so thank you so. It's just such an honor to have someone who's such a close and careful reader of our work as well. It's just like, wow, thank you so much. It's truly an honor. So the particular phrasing that you pick up on is because I wanted to also underline that, like, I'm not like the person who's suddenly alighted upon this. I feel like it's just been a grassroots thing that I've been seeing online, particularly the way that conversations about anti-Blackness have been so more mobilized and visible because of Black Lives Matter, or like around indigeneity with movements like Idle No More and the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, of like this frustration with the existing economies and the frameworks of colonial recognition. And so like, and also that just talking to friends, regardless of discipline, that I find our conversations end up in everyday life end up being not just disciplinary ones, but just like this talking about insensitivity and fatigue around scenes of violence being shared over and over again, or like with the recent resurgence of Black Lives Matter, like friends saying like, now white people know to reach out and say, are you okay? But often they're just doing that as a way to then like be like, oh, I didn't realize it was so bad. And then they're still having to do a type of emotional labor, and just people feeling so burnt out from that. And I think that if I was going to rewrite the intro now, I'd add burnout to my list of different forms of disaffection. And so I wanted to gesture to like what I see as this sort of long tradition of disaffection, which has not been properly named because of sort of the coercive grip of white sentimentalism and sympathy that has so overdetermined what sympathy and sentiment and true feeling is. And I wanted to give space for, or point out the things that which people have always known in that woman of color, feminist critique way of it as a theory in the flesh, as in something that I think speaks to both my lived experience, but the experience of many other people I care about in terms of like what they don't won't have to care about because they're expected to care all the time. And so that's, I guess, part of how I'm navigating like sort of the racialization of affect studies, as well as just sort of like the frustration with the way that affect as presented is so all-encompassing, which I feel is like, and a lot of people whose work I very much admire, like, and like thinking of also like Berlant's work in ordinary affects and Kathleen Stewart and stuff like that, that I was like, this is great, but also like the melting of all these boundaries and all this porousness. What does it mean to always have to have attachment when one might want detachment? Some of us need to draw boundaries. It's sort of also, I think, the pushback against, say, the rhetoric we hear in workplaces about care and love, and coming to work and being your whole person and your whole self. And it, like, the answer is like, yeah, that would be nice, but actually that's really exhausting. And some of us, like, we don't have to be buddy buddies. The work is not our family. Like, we might find chosen family through it, but this is not the be all and end all. And the way that is also such a coercive tool that's being mobilized, I guess, under late capitalism, as this other form of care work that now is supposed to come across all different forms of labor. Yeah, and so I think that the racialization of it is so important as one way to like demarcate, like, for whom is this sort of porousness and like fluidness and attachment to all things, like when is it useful, and for whom has the possibility of boundaries and detachment not been allowed. And so I think that, and it still has to do with like the rhetoric of self-care, particularly in cutie pox circles, and then also the way that we can so readily see it weaponized in those spaces. And how do we also have frameworks for talking about that type of burnout and desensitization, and having to withdraw. So yeah, I hope that speaks a little bit to that. If you want more time, I could expound further, but I feel like maybe I've been talking long enough.
I mean, keep talking. Yeah, I got lost in that, which was wonderful. I think you drew a line between sort of spectacular visibility and racial comparative. Yeah, I guess the question of comparative work is really important to me right now. And I think, I notice that in my work and in Xine's work, we move between whiteness, Orientalism, Asianness, and Blackness. Like we have, right? Like our work is, our people touch, right? In our work. And I don't, so this is like an idea in emergence that I'm like thinking with, which is to say, I'm trying to think about, and it's touchy work, but, and I touch on this in the PMLA piece, and there, right. So like this piece that I wrote in about 2020 that came out in the spring in PMLA called Shush, where there's a moment in which I'm, like railing, and then I say, and this is particularly to other scholars of color, what about the topography of race does not serve us anymore? Or what about the topography of race as it is constructed by institutionality for very real material purposes, right? Is actually also a limit of our thinking. And I want to be careful in saying that, but I also, because there are, in Spivak's sense, there are essentialisms that are strategic to the institution, and there are essentialisms that are simply forms of self-care, and there are essentialisms that are epistemically urgent, and that cannot be argued with. And also, there are places where people touch. And so I think in my work on, I think I might be going off into a different direction with your question, but I think in my work right now, which is, I think, essentially about touch, both the sense of everyday life as a sensory a sensory experience that that touches you, whether you like it or not, right? We're like inundated with, our senses are inundated, and I experience that as touch, but also in the sense that despite certain forms of certain strategic essentialisms, we're touching across difference all the time. And that is that's exhausting in the repetition of certain forms of extraction and just stupidity, and that wears on you. And it's also still true. And so I've been trying to think about sort of the limits and possibilities of what's called comparative, but perhaps like comparative, the language of comparison is really stuck in the kind of zero-sum logics that capital presents us with, right? That thinking with touch might be a way. I mean, comparative is like, well, if they have this, what do they have, right? Or if like that's that, but this is that, and then you end up like counting, right? So comparative is a comparative racialization or comparative racial studies is like actually like who got what and who got more, and like, but actually like what about just the kind of like places where contact, like what about just contact? And so this is like Xine brought up Martin Manalanson's work, and I think like Martin is just really good in sitting in the muck and mess, like I've always loved Martin's work. His first book, Global Diva, is just, oh my God, but he's really good at thinking with, like Jose was, of thinking with the phenomenology of the everyday. And that sort of the phenomenology of the everyday, the fact that despite my not wanting to be exhausted by racism, whether it's mine or whether it's someone else's, right? Despite us being in the tortured everyday of this horrible fallen world, we are nonetheless sharing our phenomenological experiences, nonetheless touch. And that's a kind of messy ugliness that's also sometimes a place of possibility, and also a kind of silence in our work. So yeah, that's sort of where my work is going now. So, and as you can see, it's still very chewy. I'm still working it out.
Yeah, could I speak more about the comparative, inspired by Kyla's comments? Yeah, because I really love how in Strange Affinities, Roderick Ferguson and Grace Hong sort of talk about like, yeah, the problem with the language of comparative racialization tends to assume it's sort of a flat plane of comparison. And yet I think that the problem is that there's also such an urgency in terms of doing the sort of work that would allow us to think all these forms of racialization together, and also not as exclusionary, but deeply interwoven, those intimacies of four continents, as Lisa Lowe obviously famously says. And what does it mean to stay in the messiness of it and not to turn away from it? One way I've seen this manifest in the UK is the way that there's so little space for talking about race, and like Black studies is only just getting any sort of recognition. But then also the sort of awkwardness with like that other non-Black peoples of color end up becoming sort of sometimes more anti-Black because they see that the only discourse around racialization has to do with Blackness, which I guess you also see in the US and in Canada, that like, why does their pain get all this attention kind of thing? And I think that you see this replicated on the level of the university of like, oh, is like people thinking that there's no other forms of feminism for other peoples of color, for instance. And then I sort of see this sort of duty of not just being like, no, it does exist, but also like, why is your reaction this? And what actually relationships do other forms of women of color feminism have to Black feminism as a picker, as a project in an intellectual genealogy? And in particular, like in the UK, just over the past year, we're seeing the way that the citation of Black feminist scholars far outpaces the actual hiring of Black feminists. And that, for instance, the very first MA on Black British history, which was not seen as a valid discipline, but has been started up by Christina Fryer at Goldsmiths, is now getting cut, or under threat of being cut completely, both Black British history and queer history at Goldsmiths. And so they're on strike right now to protest against that. And so I find myself as the first person of color in my department to be hired as permanent faculty. And then say like teaching race, which for my department means like they wanted me to teach like African American specifically, and then thinking like, oh, how does my very expertise as an Americanist who works on critical race and ethnic studies actually feed into this actually anti-Black disavowal of race and particularly anti-Blackness within the UK as particularly an American phenomenon. And so I feel like I've had to like read up way more, even though it's like not my field, within the UK, and thinking internationally, diasporically, to be able to address those complications and things like the way that, you know, Western institutions are dependent upon like the extraction of the tuition dollars of Chinese and Indian students primarily to fund all this different private work, but that those students arriving in these institutions don't recognize themselves as being racialized, and the way that there it ends up being this this wedge of, on the one hand, they bring up the diversity numbers, but then they're sort of pitted against like the domestic Black and brown students of color. And yeah, I just feel like this is such a messiness that I'm trying to acknowledge and wade through pedagogically and institutionally. And then also in my project, that, as I mentioned, the first form of racialized unfeeling that I was thinking through is Oriental inscrutability. And for me, of course, that's the final chapter of my book, because it's the place where I was thinking from. But then when I was thinking from it, I was like, I need to think it through in so many relation to so many other racialized and queer forms that have allowed it to also cohere and be and have a form of visibility. So the construction of the book is also, I think, an attempt to do a comparativeness, which is not a flat comparison, but thinking about my own positionality, and then at the very end doing the reveal the coda, like, surprise, as a scholar, it was me all along, kind of Scooby-Doo meme type thing, of admitting that this sort of disaffection of as a normal scholarly sense is one that I myself am sort of working through in a way that I hope is meaningful. But yeah, I guess TBD on whether or not that works or not. And thank you, Kyla, for also making space for all that messiness. I'm really excited for your third book as well, because I feel like I've been following so many conversations that even you're having on Twitter. And I just really appreciate the way that you're thinking about, like, yeah, North Africanness.
I'm really ready for that book to come out too. Up to here.
We all are.
Yeah.
I want to just ask a couple more questions, and then want to open it up for questions from other folks who are here in the Zoom meeting. But first, so I guess there are lots of different directions I feel like we could go, but I love this idea of the focus on touch. And I guess one segue I'm thinking about is I'm wondering how y'all's conceptualizations of the body and of sort of interaction or engagement within bodies have evolved throughout your projects. So for Xine, I'm thinking some about engagements with Spinoza and queer and feminist of color critique, and Kyla, this idea of queer alimentarity, which I hope I pronounced correctly, and then also for both of you, the idea of theory in the flesh, which I know Xine brought up. It just feels like there's so much there around touch and the body in your work.
I think, you know, the first book, I think I'm on and on going to be, you know, biopolitics and biopower are at the center of my work, and I sometimes think of my work as like the movement between the first book, the second book, and then what will be the third book on North Africa that Xine so kindly shouted out. It is a kind of moving upward in scale from the biopolitical, or rather from the, you know, what Foucault called the anatomopolitical, which is to say the elaboration of power at the site of the individual body, to, in the second book, thinking with these various forms of materiality, and as thinking about moving up to, he saw the biopolitical as a population level extraction. And then in the third book, thinking much more transnationally. So in the sense of, thinking in the sense of thinking with the body, it becomes a site of meaning making, very much in the tradition of feminism, of feminist thinking. And also, that without valorizing, as Xine points out, disillusion or the kind of like porosity that affect studies can give itself over to, the body is, I've moved from an interest in the elaboration of the body at the site of the individual to an elaboration of, or to an interest in much more collectivity. I don't know if I succeed in doing that, but like, so for instance, for me, fermentation, is, one of the reasons like fermentation is so fascinating to the 19th centuryists like Pasteur is that it's like the dream of capital, right? Like the dream of capital is I put a little bit in and I get a whole bunch out. And when Pasteur finally figures out what effervescence, what fermentation is, he just can't stop going like, it makes so much more, right? It produces, hi Peter, hey, it produces like, which is I think a little bit like some of it, just to kind of bring it to the present, like remember everybody going bananas about sourdough, right? Like there was something so something so great about sourdough, like people were just like, look, it bubbles, right? And there's that kind of like how does it make more than I put in? It's the capitalist dream, but it's also it become like effervescence and fermentation become figures for becoming more than just one thing in relation to other bodies, and that is both in some ways promises ecstasy. And here, like, as a kind of like, as a former club kid, I relate so much to Jose's work on, on ecstasy and all of its material and chemical and immaterial formations, but also that sense of like having, but then it's also, I think, and this is where I think racialization comes into affect studies, it becomes quickly recuperable by capital. So I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with this entirely, but I guess to say that yes, the body is consistently a site of meaning making, but for me, it's much more interesting and it has become more fruitful to move away from the individual and begin to move begin to shift to horizontality and collectivity and population. And then the last thing I'll say is that, the title of the book used to be So Moved, which I thought was like a super clever way of thinking about the juridical and affect, and it's still cute, but then I gave a talk with Mel Chen, and Mel Chen's work on agitation, and Mel has just like the best brain. And I just love being proximate to Mel's brain because like Mel does this thing that Xine used to do it too when she was my dissertation advisor, where like you give them a thing and they go, let's flip it. Let's flip it and reverse it. And you go, oh, oops, I see the limit of the thing that I was working with. So for me, like the project used to be called So Moved, but then when I encountered and was thinking with Mel and got to read more of their work on agitation, I realized that the fantasy of mobility, which is also kind of, was embedding a kind of ableist project, like an ableist assumption in my thinking about the body. And that actually Mel's work on agitation, which is both expansive in terms of its the possibilities of thinking with political agitation, but lets you sit conceptually and phenomenologically with the limits, with movement as possibly limited, which is in fact what we all are along various scales. So I guess what I'm trying to say is yes, the body, but also no, the body. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer.
No, I think it was absolutely great. And I also really appreciate you like sort of laying bare for us, like the sort of process of like how the thinking happens, and how like when we think that we're set on a thing, like the disruption is also really important, and the reassessment is not like a failing on our part, but like actually about possibility. And I think that's something that is really difficult to grapple with early on, because like it's too easy for us to always think like, this is my failing. I don't know how to do this properly. And so thank you for modeling that. I guess on touch, there's a number of different ways I want to approach this question. One being going back just to my introduction and thinking about the theory in the flesh, and how like talking about Anzaldúa and Lord, she talks about like, having to in order to withstand the weather, we had to become stone, when talking about Black women like surviving misogynoir. And as I sort of point out, like the sort of callousness that she and Anzaldúa talk about as the consequence of the wear of everyday life on one's psychic life, and the way that it requires you to grow a thick skin, because in the most basic way, it's like just the repetition of the touching over and over again, developing also like a callus to it, as a way of getting through. And that the callus is not something to be venerated, but a callus also allows you to get through repetitions and to do work despite it, and not, I think, in just and not just simply in a way that capitulates to it, but I think just opens up more possibilities, like the calluses on our feet, the calluses in our hands when we're doing types of work, types of dance, types of play, is something that's useful to think about, and generative. That touch is something that's important to acknowledge, but also like you don't want people to touch, well, for black people in particular, touch your hair, for instance, as the Solange song goes. And so that's what I'm hoping with Unfeeling and Disaffection, like I'm trying to open up space for, is like both like continuing to attend to thinking about touch and feeling, but then also the possibility to say no, or to like develop a type of insensibility as a necessity to and as a means of survival tactic that doesn't necessarily have to rise to the instrumentalized level of coherent resistance, but sometimes it's just like the only way that you get through things. On the other side, I also want to just think about touch and how its relationship to disgust, and of course, like the cringe that we were talking about way earlier before this recording, in case anyone's watching this at this point. And cringe is this quality of like the pulling away, and the way that it's interesting, again, living in England and seeing the way that colonial discourses persist, but also the way that we sort of refigure them. And so in this rubric, I'm going to tie this back to Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather, because I didn't realize Imperial Leather was also a soap that still exists today that you can buy. And so when I first moved to the UK, and I was like having to buy like, detergents, which they call washing up liquid. And I was looking at just things, and I was like, there's actual Imperial Leather here. And then I also learned through an Atlas Obscura article that white settler British colonists to Aotearoa don't rinse the soap off their dishes when they're washing them, and that this is something that is a consequence of British colonialism. And I posted on Facebook about it. And then I learned that this is truly a practice that most white British people still do, that they do not rinse off their plates. And then I was just going around to my British friends of color, because I was actually way from British friends of color than white Brits, tellingly, I guess, and being like, I just learned that they don't rinse their plates. And my friends being like, yeah, this is a thing. And I think I bring this up because I think it's such a bizarre thing of like the reworking of, obviously, Anne McClintock's sort of tracing of how that, soap has been this tool of colonial racism. And yet now, like, the failure to fully clean your dishes is like a hallmark of white Britishness that has has been scattered through settler colonialism. And I think this dovetails also with the work that a friend of mine is doing, Rihanna Walcott, who's doing her PhD in Black Digital Humanities, and the sort of analysis she's done on the way in Black Twitter, and that has also inspired other, I think, Indigenous and Twitter of color discourse, of the way that white people don't wash their legs, and as a way of like talking about and encoding, thinking about whiteness. And yeah, this sort of the reversal of who gets to be disgusted by whom, that indeed, like we're used to thinking about disgust as a tool of management on the part of colonial power, but then also what about peoples of color stuck at the metropole now realizing that if you go to a white household, you're eating off plates that haven't been cleaned properly. Yeah, this is also a battle, like moving in with my partner and being like, please rinse them, oh my God. Anyway.
Wow, I'm without words.
It's horrifying. This is like one of the things that you learn, that you don't think that you think you know a place because you think England has to be so approximate because Canada, we're so impacted by America and England on the other side, and between these regimes, and like you didn't know all along that they're not rinsing off their plates and pots and pans when they're cleaning them.
Wow. Also, shout out to Anne McClintock's book, by the way. I mean, I don't think I really I think this year or last year was the 25th anniversary or the 30th anniversary of Imperial Leather, which was like, by the way, the book that she was refused tenure for at Columbia. And so, yeah, like would our work be possible without Anne McClintock's work? I don't think so. It profoundly shaped my trajectory.
Wow, same. Did not know that. I just wanted to end with one last really fast question. So for those of you who have questions, let them percolate for a minute more, and then you can either type them into the chat or under the reactions on your Zoom bar, you should see raise hand as an option. So feel free to do either. But I guess in the spirit of getting to have this awesome conversation, and also thinking with one of Xine's lines that I think has particularly stuck with me. Xine, you write that you linger with unfeeling rather than dismissing or exonerating it. And I guess for me, reading your book, I've been thinking a lot about the work that lingering can do in scholarship and also pedagogy. So I guess I would love to just end on a note where if either of y'all have questions that you're continuing to sort of linger on, or thoughts about your classroom pedagogy and how lingering sort of permeates both worlds, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And I feel like it was also particularly reading queer color theorists and Jose Munoz's work that made me think so much more about like the work that our writing is doing to the process of criticism and theorizing, and the way that he used verbs very deliberately. And so like my use of lingering, I think is very much inspired by that. And yeah, I think that lingering is just interesting because I think it's evanescence and beautiful and endures and like sort of shifts like the boundaries of when something begins and ends. But also it's, I think, sort of it also sometimes can be an exhausted affect. I think it's also a chronic one. Something I'm still trying to really think through is like disability studies, because as someone with chronic illness, I've actually sort of avoided it for a while because it almost feels too close to home because it sort of feels painful. But now I feel like now I'm trying to get more into it and following like the work of disability scholars on Twitter, like Travis Wing Chin Lao, for instance, and being like, this is okay to think with, and also Mel Chen's work on brain fog in particular, and having experienced like really intense brain fog after my PhD that made that I couldn't write, like I found myself incapable of putting together a coherent sentence for the first year of my postdoc because I just felt so shattered. And now recognizing for myself when I read my students' work as well, that there's a type of writing incoherence that's not about ability, but it's also about when I can recognize now as like a severe depression and also like a chronic health problem. And even going back to the page of notes that I was able to write my first year and seeing how broken the sentences were, I could see now for myself the way that my brain was trying to linger and not fully able to talk through, but just the importance of persisting. so I don't think that's quite an answer to your work, but I guess just a way of saying what that particular word means to me and what it's actually indebted to in a way that is not visible on the page and that I don't have a footnote attached to. And I just like that, again, the sort of expedience that with which a type of activism and politics means that you have to quickly mobilize things into a way that's supposed to be emotionally and politically coherent, and to be seen as useful. And what does it mean to like stay with the moments that don't fit with that? And I think it's difficult also pedagogically because just the time in the classroom is limited. How many seminars are you teaching? How can you teach like lingering as a mode as opposed to like the efficiency of fitting it within a 50-minute window, which is in itself important. But then can you give your students things that will linger with them beyond the classroom, which I think is the best kind of teaching.
Yeah. I think what I love about lingering too is it offers a model for staying with or being with without perhaps extracting from. And you know, someone whose work has really helped me with this is Eva Hayward's work. Trans STS scholar who, and because I have this chapter on jelly, where she has this wonderful ethnography of the jellyfish aquarium at Monterey, which is just a kind of like, you know, an attempt to think with being with jellyfish without, although, you know, like what is an aquarium except a certain form of imprisonment and extraction. But yeah, that lingering, what I love about Xine's formulation of lingering is it offers a way of like I just said, being with without extracting. And also that, you know, sentimentalism metabolizes discomfort. And you know, metabolism as the you know, like, I mean, Marx's what is it, Stoffwechsel, I can't always say it wrong, but you know, Marx's figure for you know, the efficient and proper use of both matter and energy. That mode of like what for me in the first book was indigestion. Oh my God, will you stop fussing, you crazy dog? Sorry, I'll turn around and let him out in a second. But yeah, to linger with discomfort is to not metabolize it, and to not metabolize it is to let its fullness express itself. So yeah, I love that as a model, and also as a model for slow, which is like the thing you're never allowed to be, is slow. You know, I'm guilty of this myself as a working mom, of wanting other people to like, hurry up, I'm busy. But you know, slowness is perhaps another thing, you know, modality to think with. And let me let this little pain in the butt out. Hold on.
All right, thank y'all so much. I see we have one question in the chat so far. Says, I'd like to hear more about how minoritized people can use unfeeling or no display of excessive sentimentality on their behalf in our contemporary society. How do they create a counter-narrative of white sentimentality or dismantle colonial power?
Oh, that's such a big question, Juan. And thank you so much for attending our talk and being another awesome POC 19 person. Shout out. Yeah, I think like part of it, I think, has to do with the pushback that we already see online of like that not to circulate like videos of Black death and pain. That is also about like now this changing the discourse around like what sort of evidence needs to be paraded about and spectacularized and be pointed to again and again, and for whose benefit. And so I think that that's part of the conversation that we're seeing. I think it's also about, I think, a type of strategic vulnerability that I find myself mobilizing to do certain types of work in the university, that sometimes I speak from my experience and some other times I'm like, I'm not going to do that work right now. I don't have to like give you my backstory to to claim a type of legitimacy or to articulate a kind of pain. But at the same time, I know that for other people's, I will do that. So it's not like a complete refusal. It's like a strategy, the way that Sharon Moraga says, like the theory in the flesh, about to whom do you disclose, and who do you call an ally, call a friend. And so that's part of what motivates my thinking around it. I think it also has to do with just also the way that we experience microaggressions in everyday life. And something I'm just thinking about this week, that a friend had the presence of mind when that they were walking across campus and had an anti-Asian slur yelled at them, and then they had the presence of mind to whip out their phone and confront the guy and be like, say it again, say what the hell you just said, you racist piece of shit. But then also like the other day I had someone do the classic, are you from China thing, and just being like, oh, I don't have time for this. So I was just like, I just was behind the mask and like, thank God I just have a mask. I'm like, no, I'm just gonna walk away. And also and then not beating myself up for not reacting. That there's a space for like both my friends' badassery, but then also when people say random crap to you in public, that you shouldn't have to beat yourself up with the l'esprit d'escalier of like what I could have said that was like really snappy. It's enough that we got through it, I think, and to realize that it's not a failure on our part or a lack of political engagement, but it's valid and has a place in and of itself. So I feel like hopefully that speaks to it in a small way. I'd say another way that I've been talking about it with some non-academic groups that I've been presenting my work to has been like, well, white woman being like, I now recognize that I'm the problem, but what do I do? And the way that I've been saying is like, well, recognize when it's not about you and hold back the emotion, and to recognize like, whose feeling are you centering, and what feelings are you performing, and whose emotional labor are you demanding? And I think like that's also another thing to think about pedagogically, that we, of course, like one is reliant upon a certain amount of sentimentalism and sympathy that you can't necessarily control. That is how people outsiders become fascinated with the topic to begin with and want to make a difference. But then once they come in, you can't be so grateful that's maybe the way they came in. You have to then be like, okay, that was good that you did this, but now you can't pat yourself on the back. Now, what does it mean to also modulate your own reaction to it, and who are you centering in these moments?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm super bad at being unaffected, and I'm really working on it because it just drains your creative energy. But I'm particularly aware of a particular mode of in this non-cancel culture moment that there's a particular mode of performance of being the naughty white guy who says the horrible thing and experiencing your freedom as experiencing your freedom to be a dick as intellectual bravery. I mentioned no names, but that in terms of the mode of disaffection, it became like super interesting to me to become bored by that. Right? That is just like, it's actually not that interesting. It's actually not an interesting intellectual position, but also that the drama of performance of that demands someone to go, you're so naughty, like, ooh, you're so bad, and like actually if you like withdraw that, if you withdraw from that provocation, you save a lot of your own energy. That was something I had to kind of discover in myself over the last few years.
It looks like we have a hand, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is it Oishani?
Hi, thank you so much. This is so wonderful, and to also hear you both in conversation and to engage with your project separately as well. I've been kind of picking up this thread of whiteness and white emotion that engulfs space when Kyla talked about civility, when also Xine talked about expressivity and new forms of white disaffection that pop up when there are other political problems that the polis or the sort of democratic civil space has to engage with at that time. And while I was listening to that thread of this kind of new white affects that take up space and take up energy and constantly sort of reinvent themselves to drag away attention. The other thing that I was hearing you both talk about was a kind of racial affects, as in affects being present in racial bodies, but ones that puncture, or ones that that the horrified laughter that Kyla talked about, or the lack of engagement, or that Xine talked about, or I think more specifically the one of like also the horrified reaction to soap, for instance, that are incitements to writing or incitements to theory. So thinking about if you could talk about the relationship between these two for you, are they connected? Or do they happen together, the generation of new white affects and this sort of work of puncturing that I think you're both engaged in some way?
Thank you. That's such a wonderfully generative question. I guess like the thing is like the answer I think is yes, because it's in, but like we can't. There's something that's just so suffocating about these white affects that like the goalposts keep changing in terms of what is valid, whose tiers are valid. In fact, there's too many examples, obviously, like the Rittenhouse stuff, and like recently in the UK, the way that the one press secretary was like just crying when they were exposed as having this illegal Christmas party, and there's all these white woman tears. And this that, yeah, I think that having to tend to racialized forms of affects isn't simply like a necessity, an intellectual necessity, but also one that just simply reflects how so many of us have to navigate everyday life, and to recognize the validity of it as a particular racialized phenomenon that has to do with this hierarchy of whose tears matter, whose feelings matter. And that's why I sort of end with like, obviously the playoff of all lives matter, like we have to push beyond the claim that all feelings matter is how I end. Yeah, and I think that I would also want to name that in previous talks, people pointed out that an essay that sort of speaks to my work and I think in ways really super useful, and is Namwali Serpal's essay on Unbothered, and thinking about that as a particular racialized, particularly Black form of disaffection, and thinking across my archive as well of what I see, the sort of Oriental inscrutability of these Chinese migrant workers who just don't want to rise to the bait, or like, you know, they don't, or also against like the sort of need to perform fealty to the nation state, like, hey, what if they're just sojourners after all? And it's okay to say that they didn't want to be American, as opposed to the insistence of like, yes, then they were so American, which I think is obviously the other refuge that we see for minoritized peoples. Like, we are the truest of the Americans, or the truest of the Canadians. And instead to be like, what does it mean to be disaffected from a particular nation state? And to not have to perform like those forms of belonging, because maybe you don't care, and you shouldn't have to care in order to receive some sort of a decent treatment from people.
Yeah. Oshani, what I love about am I saying your name properly? Please feel free to correct me. Okay, thank you. So what I love about your question is, or the piece that I picked up on that felt fruitful was that you know, we're two kinds of workers. We're creative workers and we're intellectual workers, and we're also institutional workers, is, you know, as well as teachers. And sometimes it's called, they call it service, which is like, I wish we could lose that. It's not, I mean, it's a terrible word, service. Anyway, it's so abasing, like, I mean, you know what I mean? Like it inculcates you into an abased relation to the institution. I think I've spent a lot of my career taking up having to wrestle racism because it mattered to me to impact to the institution in ways that would make make it more livable for myself, and B, make it more livable for others. And that just meant negotiating with, you know, some really dumb and some really violent people. And also some really dumb and some really violent institutional structures that had the faces of people on them. And having done that, and I think that that's important work for all of us to do, because the work we do, despite the kind of like fabulous melancholy of, you know, frankly, a lot of white guys who are Marxists who study poetry, like who are, you know what I mean? Who, I don't know why it's always that guy who's like, why is it always that fucking guy? And he's like, what you're doing is not political. And it's like this sort of like fabulous form of melancholy. I do think the work that it's and passive, but like the work that we do is very political. Like, we are teachers, and I was impacted by my teachers profoundly, even when I hated them or disagreed with them. And then sometimes when they challenged me, and sometimes often when they had things to say. So the work we do is profoundly political in terms of the thousands of people who will come through our classroom, who will have a chance to engage in this luxurious thing called having an idea in community, and then the work we do is political as institutional actors, because we have to fight to protect that and make those spaces as capacious as possible. So, you know, the kind of institutional and teaching work we do is political, and that has meant engaging whiteness in ways that were often like profoundly costly, like really costly, like disability costly, like breaking down costly, like being exhausted costly. And so, you know, in terms of engaging whiteness, like I feel like we all in the end will have to do that work, because we have to fight. To not fight is like, you know, not acceptable. And also, there just also comes a time when you've done that work, and it's time to go back to not trying to make other people better. Right, which is actually not the work. The work is not to make other people better. I'm not here to engage. They're not very interesting, those people, but rather to do kind of structural change, but then to kind of come back to your own work. And they're like the movement back and forth between those two institutional realities. Like, on the one hand, we have to be engaged in the politics of institutional change and in the important work of safeguarding space to think in productive and less unsafe ways for the thousands of people that we will encounter across the space of our teaching lives. And on the other hand, the time when it's like, okay, I need to do intake as well. I need to take in, and I need to attend to my creative energy. And those are two different kinds of affective labors. And that question of like that thing that I noticed at the end of writing my first book, where I was like, oh, the things that make me laugh and are horrified, like the moment when I laugh and I'm horrified, is a moment where I know that I've noticed something. I'm not sure if I'm making any space, but just like in terms of like mapping one's affective life in these extractive institutions, that there are definitely forms that feeling and thinking are actually coming together, and that part of my job as a scholar and as an intellectual, and then also as a teacher, is to notice when those two things are happening at the same time. Like, that's part of my pedagogy, but that's also part of my growth as an intellectual, to bring feeling and thinking into more clarity as they connect, and then let that feed my creativity into better work. Did that make any sense? Did it? Thank you for the thumbs up. I kind of got lost.
No, that was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
Oh no, it definitely made sense. Yeah. I want to be mindful of not taking up too much time on Kyla's birthday, but I see there's one more question in the chat. That's from Stephanie. Stephanie, if you'd like to unmute yourself and read it, that would be all right. Or I'm also happy to read it aloud.
Oh, I can do that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It's funny, I was driving home listening to you all as engaged in conversation. It was Lovely. I was going to ask Xine actually. Well, you had mentioned earlier that you were kind of distancing yourself from disability studies, and so I wondered if you thought about the implications of disaffected for disability studies. So on the one level, there's been some discomfort because as someone in disability studies, there's discomfort with the prefix DIS because it implies negativity towards those who identify as disabled. But then there's also this level of not being able to distance oneself from feeling, even if you want to, because of the pain associated with chronic illness. And I was thinking in part about long COVID, but other chronic illnesses as well. Or on the other hand, in the mental health community, we also talk about sitting with our feelings and embracing them or exploring them and not pushing away from them. So perhaps in the same way that you discussed sitting with unfeeling, it's just I haven't really formulated any thoughts. It's just kind of gelling and percolating together. And then another thought that also, sorry, there was a lot going on in my brain while you're talking about disability, is another thought that was kind of percolating in my mind was the disability scholars like Ellen Samuels who discussed the co-making of race and disability during the long 19th century. So then how might the co-making of race and disability hold space for disaffection or unfeeling?
Thank you, Stephanie. When Corey sees we're gonna wrap up, I was like, wait, but this really awesome question in the chat that I really want to engage. And so
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for giving me this opportunity. I feel like it's my 5th chapter that is able to start to grapple with the abilities about the consequences for disability. Because one of my favorite articles on Xine Farr has to do with thinking about how her unnamed chronic illness is a way of registering violence. And I'm in a family where all of us have chronic illness to some extent, and that just being sort of this condition that is to the level of the unthought just because it's continually experienced. And so at least with Xine Farr, when I look at how she talks about, say, pain and feeling, and particularly with one line where she talks about I come from a race on my mother's side, which is said to be the most unfeeling of all races. And yet I find myself feeling so keenly and talking about the pain that she's experiencing and the sort of chronic illness that she has where her heart feels so vulnerable. And the space I think that's necessary for, yes, sitting with it and acknowledging it, but then all the times in which she also wants to distance herself, also does not feel like she wants to have to perform her pain for others, that it's about a pain that she's acknowledging for herself, but it's not something that has to be shared necessarily, that there has to be space for it being an antisocial one as opposed to something as being performed to receive sympathy or pity. And so that's part of how I was trying to think about it. And then in my 3rd chapter, particularly when I'm talking about anesthesia and then how I think it overlies with not just a queer sexuality, but also about the possibilities of asexuality and aromanticism, which of course end up being pathologized as forms of disability, and that the way that the parent lacks in themselves are valid expressivity is also part of what I want to think about. And it's something that I just need to linger with a lot more, that I've been reading more disability studies work, but I also just in a way find it painful that, for instance, the one essay that I think is really amazing, but was really hard for me to read was A Sick Woman Theory. And because it came at a time when my health was particularly terrible, both physical and mental. And there's a sort of way in which I was too sick to read Sick Woman Theory because it just felt too close. And I feel like that's something I want to think through, that I feel like a lot of the theoretical methodologies I work with is precisely because of my positionality, but somehow disability and thinking about its racialization and so forth has been something that's deeply necessary, but also sort of unbearable at the same time. And this is just something that I'm navigating for myself, as well as its implications, I think, for others and for people that I care about. And I guess I don't have any good answers, but that again, near the end of the work and in the final chapter, the way that I'm working through that, I think is very representative of the way that I am trying to acknowledge it, but the sort of difficulty and the sort of distancing processes that I'm still trying to work through in terms of thinking about it. Yeah, so I feel like that's sort of an unsatisfactory answer, but I thought it'd be also useful for me to sort of work through the unsatisfactoriness of it and be like, this is something that I'm having to think through and feel through and linger with, really. So thank you, Stephanie, for giving me an opportunity to do that.
You're welcome. It's something we as disability scholars sit with a lot ourselves, like how vulnerable can we be in our scholarship? How much do we talk about our own personal experiences? So I'm right there with you, sitting in the mess.
Thank you. I feel like we were in good company then. Thank you so much.
Great company in the mess. It looks like we have one more question and then we could wrap up, but I know otherwise I feel like I have so many questions and I'm sure everyone does, so this could go on for so long in a really lovely way. But it looks like Catherine, would you like to read your question?
I mean, I can. I didn't even mean to like insist that it be included. I just wanted to make sure that you know, I didn't put it in at the beginning, basically. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I just going way back to earlier in the conversation, I was intrigued by the idea of fermentation and the idea of getting a lot out of a little and the connections to capital. And Kyla, I was just wondering, in terms of the biblical story of the loaves and the fishes, and this question of abundance being sort of like divinely possible, and if that clashes with a materialist reading, or if it resonates, or in what way. And then I just also wanted to thank Professor Xine for mentioning the fractured writing and the teaching context, and sort of note the impossibility of lingering in some contexts. That's all. And happy birthday, of course.
Oh gosh, you hit on my Achilles heel, which is that you know, it's I don't think about Christianity a lot. I didn't grow up with it, but it's so like but also like that's such a bad 19th century thing to say, because what is the 19th century without the omnipresence of Christianity, right? So I guess I would say, so yeah, in the sense, okay, so how to get to that? In the chapter on fermentation, I'm very much in conversation with work in the energy humanities that looks at the history of physics and at the history of chemistry, and thinks about how thermodynamics, which is to say the closed system of the first and second law of the closed system formation of the first and second law of physics, which later at the biopolitical, in terms of the history of biopolitics, becomes the logic of the calorie, right? Like what you put in and what you put out, which then informs certain kinds of development models and aid. How the history of thermodynamics maps onto Protestantism and particularly Protestant ideas of work to become a dominant metaphor for both labor and productivity, but also sustenance and compensation in the 19th century. So that kind of the wildness of fermentation, right? Like Sandra Katz has a new book on a book came out a year or two ago, to my irritation, called Fermentation as Metaphor. So that on the one hand, the input-output model of both metabolic life and thermodynamics, which also of course underlies psychoanalysis, becomes the model for productivity. But on the other hand, effervescence and the too muchness or excess of fermentation becomes a language, at least for, you know, Alcott in that crazy story. Such a kinky person, Alcott, right? Like we really like underestimate her like super erotic investment in objects, but effervescence becomes both pleasure and also creativity. So I would say I wasn't thinking about that parable in particular, but certainly Protestantism and work and science and the ways that they model onto each other are at the center of how I'm thinking about ferment. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, but also then just, you know, for I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming, and a huge thank you to Xine and Kyla for joining us. An amazing way to have a Friday at the various different, I guess, times it is around the world right now. So thank you all so much, and we really appreciate everyone coming.
Thank you for having us.
It was nice to see you. Hi, Natasha.